I love hearing how things unfold differently than you expected. But what I didn't expect was that the person who would save me wasn't going to be a lawyer, or a private investigator, or even a good friend with the right connections. It was going to be my 20-year-old nephew, and he didn't say a word about it until it was already done. The morning my brother called me, I was in the parking lot of a Home Depot, sitting in my truck with a coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. I remember that detail because I was staring at the cup when he said it. Not at him, not at anything, just the cup. She moved the money, man. All of it. I didn't answer right away. I think I was waiting for the part where he told me he was joking. He wasn't joking. My wife, we'd been together 11 years, married for 8, had transferred the entirety of my father's inheritance out of the joint account we'd held it in. The account we had agreed was untouchable. The account that was supposed to become the down payment on a piece of land my dad had always wanted us to have, and moved it somewhere I didn't know about. Somewhere she'd been planning for a while, based on the timestamps my brother found when he finally got access to the statements. She'd been planning it for 4 months. 4 months. While we were eating dinner together, while I was fixing the gutters on the house, while I was sitting next to her on the couch watching whatever she wanted to watch because I was tired and it was easier to just let her pick. 4 months. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after I hung up the phone. I didn't cry. I don't know why, because I'm not someone who avoids that. I think I was just too far behind. Like my brain hadn't caught up to the information yet. I kept thinking about the land, the 83 acres in eastern Tennessee that my dad had been trying to get us to buy for 6 years before he died. He'd walked that property with me twice, shown me where the creek ran in the spring, told me there were deer trails through the back ridge that hadn't changed since he was a kid. That land was supposed to be ours. Now I didn't know where the money was, and I didn't know where my wife was, and I didn't know anything except that my coffee was cold and the Home Depot parking lot smelled like exhaust and cut lumber. I drove to my brother's house. He met me at the door before I even knocked. He must have seen the truck pull in, and he just stepped aside and let me in. He didn't say anything for a while, which was the right thing. My brother is good at knowing when talking makes it worse. We sat at his kitchen table, and he slid the bank statements across to me, and I read them in silence. The transfers were clean. Methodical. Small enough at first that they wouldn't trigger any alert, then larger as she apparently got more confident. The last one, 3 weeks before that morning, was for the amount that cleared out what remained. $31,000. Gone to an account I didn't recognize. I found the account number, my brother said. It's in her name only. She opened it 14 months ago. 14 months. I put the papers down. I looked at the wall behind my brother's head, at the framed photo of our dad from maybe 1987, holding up a fish he'd caught at some lake in Kentucky, grinning like he'd never heard the word trouble. Where is she? I asked. My brother was quiet for a second. I don't know exactly. Her location's off on her phone. But she mentioned Scottsdale to Jenna last month, her college roommate. Scottsdale. That was something. It wasn't much, but it was something. I nodded. I folded the bank statements carefully, which is a strange thing to do when you're in shock, but I folded them and put them in my jacket pocket. I thanked my brother. I got back in my truck. That night, I sat in my own house, which suddenly felt like a stage set with no one else in the cast, and I tried to figure out what I was going to do. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have a plan. I had a brother who was furious on my behalf, an empty joint account, and a property in Tennessee that would now have to stay in someone else's hands. What I didn't know, sitting there in the quiet of a house that used to feel like mine, was that my nephew had already started. His name is Arlo. He's 20, and he's the kind of kid who has always been easy to underestimate. Quiet. Doesn't volunteer information. Shows up to family things and sits in a corner with his phone, and you think he's not paying attention, but then 3 weeks later he'll bring up something you said in passing and you realize he heard every word. He'd been staying with my brother while taking classes at the community college, studying information systems, which sounds dry until you understand what it actually means, which is that Arlo had spent the last 2 years learning in specific and practical detail how digital information moves and where it leaves traces. He came to my house on a Wednesday. I hadn't called him. He just showed up, knocked twice, and stood on my porch with a laptop under his arm and an expression on his face that I didn't know how to read. Uncle, he said, which is what he's called me his whole life. Not by name, just that. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. Same table my wife and I had eaten at for 8 years, and he opened the laptop without saying much. He turned it to face me. You need to see this before I tell you what I did, he said, because I want you to understand what you're looking at first. What I was looking at was a spreadsheet. Clean columns, dates, amounts, account numbers. It took me about 30 seconds to understand that what I was seeing was a complete transaction history. Not just the transfers I already knew about, but earlier ones. Smaller ones I hadn't seen. And beside each transaction, a corresponding record, email receipts, a PDF of a lease agreement, screenshots of a conversation on a platform I didn't recognize. A lease agreement in Scottsdale. Signed 8 months ago. She had an apartment, I said. For 8 months, Arlo said. She was flying out on the weekends. She told you she was visiting her mother. I sat back in my chair. I thought about those weekends. I hadn't questioned them because why would I? Her mother was getting older. Of course she was going to visit. The person she's been seeing, Arlo said, and paused and chose his words carefully in the way he always does, is a real estate investor, based in Phoenix. They met at a conference she went to for work about 1.5 years ago. The conference. I'd helped her pack for that one. I'd driven her to the airport. I'm not going to tell you all of it right now, Arlo said, because there's a more important thing. He scrolled down. The account she moved the money into. She thought it was private. It's not private anymore. I looked at him. What does that mean? He folded his hands on the table, very calm, very deliberate. It means that about 6 weeks ago, when Dad told me what was happening, I started paying attention. And about 3 weeks ago, when I saw the last transfer, I stopped just watching what Arlo had done. And he walked me through it carefully because he wanted to make sure I understood it was all traceable, all legal, all documented. Was pieced together a paper trail that a forensic accountant couldn't have built faster. He'd used publicly available records, email metadata my wife had accidentally exposed by forwarding a document from her work account to a personal one, and a data broker lookup that returned the Scottsdale address. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was the call he'd made 3 weeks earlier to the bank where my wife had opened her private account. Because here's something most people don't know. When you open a joint account with someone, and that account receives funds that can be documented as belonging to both parties, an inheritance, in this case from my father, payable to me, certain protections apply. Arlo knew this. He'd looked it up. He'd confirmed it with a financial law resource his professor had shared in a class about digital asset protection. He hadn't gone to the bank alone. He'd gone with my brother, who had a copy of my father's estate documents, which showed clearly that the inheritance was designated for me specifically. The bank could not legally release those funds to a single party without documentation showing clear sole ownership. My wife had moved the money, but she'd moved it into an account that was now flagged, frozen pending documentation review, and going nowhere. She doesn't know yet, Arlo said. He said it quietly, not with any satisfaction, just as a fact. When she tries to access it, he continued, she's going to find out that she needs to provide proof that those funds weren't jointly owned marital assets, and she won't be able to because they were. And the trail I built shows exactly how they moved and where they came from. I didn't say anything for a long time. You did this 3 weeks ago? I said finally. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? He looked at me with that steady, unhurried expression he's had since he was about 12 years old. Because telling you before it was finished would have just made you worry about something you couldn't control. I wanted to give you the whole picture at once. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about my dad. I thought about the property in Tennessee, the creek, the deer trails through the back ridge. Is it finished? I asked. Almost, Arlo said. There's one more thing I need you to sign. We filed the paperwork on a Thursday. My brother came with us, and we sat in the office of a family law attorney my brother had found, and we went through it all. The attorney looked at what Arlo had built and was quiet for a moment and then said in a very measured way that this was the most organized documentation she'd received from a non-professional in 15 years of practice. Arlo just nodded like that was the expected outcome. The filing went in that afternoon. It included a request for a restraining order on the flagged account, documentation of the asset trail, and the lease agreement in Scottsdale, which established that my wife had been maintaining a secondary residence with funds drawn from our shared finances. I drove home alone that evening. I made dinner, which I hadn't done with any real intention in weeks. Just pasta with whatever was in the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen table and ate it, and the house was quiet, and for the first time since the parking lot, it was a kind of quiet I could breathe in. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I felt exhausted and sad and strangely, surprisingly clear. Like when you've been driving in fog for a long time and then suddenly the road just opens up and you can see the lines again. I went to bed early. I slept better than I had in months. She called on a Saturday morning. I was outside. I'd driven up to my cousin's property to help him clear some brush, partly because he needed the help and partly because I needed to do something with my hands, something that made a visible difference, something I could point to and say, that's what I did today. That mattered. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I looked at the screen, and I stood there in the middle of a half-cleared patch of Tennessee hillside for a moment before I answered. Hey, I said. What came back was not a greeting. She was calling from Scottsdale, clearly, because I could hear the particular flatness of a place with no trees and the distant sound of traffic that didn't sound like anywhere near here. She was talking fast and loud, and there was a tone in her voice I don't think I'd ever heard before, not in 11 years. Something that was trying to be anger but kept slipping into something that sounded more like panic. She had gone to the bank. She had tried to move the money again. I would learn later that she'd been planning to wire it to an investment account connected to the man she was with, and she had been told that the account was under a legal hold. She wanted to know how. She wanted to know who had done it. I waited until she ran out of words, which took a while. My cousin had stopped working and was watching me from about 30 feet away with an expression of careful neutrality, which I appreciated. When she finally went quiet, I said, "The money was my father's. You knew that." She started again. Something about community property, something about how I should have talked to her, something about how she was going to get a lawyer. "You should," I said. "Get a lawyer. That's actually a good idea." Then I said, "Tell your lawyer to ask to see the documentation. All of it." I hung up. My cousin walked over slowly, picking up his work gloves from the ground as he came. He looked at me for a second. "You okay?" he said. I thought about it honestly. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am. I want to tell you the part of this that I think about the most, which isn't the legal outcome, though the outcome was right. The account was unfrozen in my name with full documentation. The funds came back. The land in Tennessee is under contract now. We close in 6 weeks, and I'm going to build something modest on the back ridge where the deer trails run, and I'm going to do it for my dad, who never got to see it happen. That part matters. Of course it matters, but the part I think about most is a Tuesday night. About 2 weeks after Arlo had come to my house with the laptop. I'd driven over to my brother's place to drop off some tools I'd borrowed, and Arlo was there, at the same kitchen table where he'd shown me everything, just doing homework, some kind of database assignment. He looked up when I came in and said, "Hey," and went back to his screen. I stood there for a minute. "How did you know to start looking when you did?" I asked him. He was quiet for a second, still typing. "Dad mentioned it in passing," he said. "Said something seemed off, and I paid attention." He said it like it was the most obvious thing. Like, of course you pay attention when someone you love is being taken from. Like, what else would you do? I had driven him to his first day of school when he was 5 years old. Because my brother's car had broken down and my brother had called me at 6 a.m., and I'd just gotten up and done it, no question. Arlo had sat in the back seat, very serious and very quiet, with his backpack on his lap, like he was heading into something important. He was always heading into something important. He was always heading into something important. I just hadn't always been paying close enough attention to see it. "Thank you," I said. He looked up from the screen. That steady look. "Family," he said. Which wasn't really an answer, but it was the right thing to say. I think about what I'd tell someone going through this. Not advice exactly. I'm not qualified to give advice. Just what I know now that I didn't know in the parking lot with a cold coffee. You don't always know who's in your corner until something tests it. And sometimes the person who saves you is the one you thought was just sitting quietly in the corner, not paying attention. The one you've driven to school and watched grow up and maybe underestimated in ways you didn't even realize. Pay attention to those people. And if you're keeping something from the people who love you because you think it will protect them, think twice about that. My wife kept things from me for over a year. She told herself a story about it, I'm sure. that she deserved something, that I wouldn't understand, that it was easier this way. Arlo kept things from me for 3 weeks, and it was the most useful thing anyone has ever done for me. The difference wasn't the keeping, it was what was being protected. The land closes in 6 weeks. My cousin is going to help me pour the foundation. My brother is coming up for the weekend, and Arlo is coming with him. And we're going to stand on that back ridge where the deer trails run and look at whatever comes next. I've been thinking about what my dad would say if he could see it. I think he'd say something practical and a little dry, and then he'd stand there real quiet for a minute, and you'd know he was moved even though he'd never come out and say it. I think he'd say, "Well, it took a while, but here you are." Yeah, here I am. I've thought a lot about what actually made this whole thing possible. And it wasn't the lawyer, it wasn't the bank, it wasn't even the documentation Arlo built, as precise and damning as it was. It was the fact that he was paying attention when I wasn't. That's the part that stays with me. I was sitting in a parking lot with cold coffee, completely blindsided, because I had trusted without watching. I had assumed that what looked stable was stable, and she had counted on that. She had counted on me being the kind of person who doesn't check the accounts, because checking feels like distrust. She understood something about me that I hadn't fully understood about myself. That I extended good faith so automatically I'd stopped noticing whether it was being earned. That's not a virtue. I used to think it was. I used to think that trusting people fully was the generous thing, the right thing. But there's a difference between trust and inattention. Trust is something you give consciously, with clear eyes. Inattention is just absence dressed up as faith, and I had been absent in ways I didn't recognize until it was already too late to stop the damage before it happened. Arlo didn't make that mistake. Not because he's suspicious by nature, he isn't. He's one of the most straightforward people I know. But he was raised to pay attention. My brother, for all his faults, always told that kid, "Watch carefully, think before you speak, and when something feels wrong, don't talk yourself out of it." Arlo took that seriously in a way I think a lot of us stop doing once we get comfortable. Comfort is where we stop growing. I know that sounds simple, but I mean it practically, not philosophically. When things feel fine, we stop asking questions. We stop checking. We stop doing the small disciplines, the noticing, the verifying, the following up, that protect us not from enemies but from our own blind spots. My wife didn't take that money because she was smarter than me. She took it because I had made myself easy to take from. That's the thing about integrity. Your own integrity. I mean, not other people's. It isn't just about doing right by others. It's about being honest enough with yourself to see clearly. I wasn't seeing clearly for a long time, and the cost was real. The money came back, the land is coming together, but those months of fog, the confusion of discovering that someone I built a life with had been running a separate one, that cost doesn't just disappear because the legal outcome was right. What I carry forward is this: do the work of paying attention before you need to, not obsessively, not without trust, but with eyes open. The people who love you are worth that. The things you're building are worth that. And if you have someone in your life like Arlo, quiet, steady, watching carefully from the corner, do not underestimate them. They are often seeing everything you're missing. The land closes in 6 weeks. I'm going to stand on that back ridge with my brother and my nephew and look at what's left to build. That's the outcome. But the lesson isn't the outcome. The lesson is what Arlo already knew when he was sitting at that kitchen table doing homework. When someone you love is in trouble, you don't wait to be asked. You pay attention. You do the work. And you show up with the whole picture, not just the pieces that are easy to say. That's what intelligence in service of integrity actually looks like. Not a grade, not a credential. A Tuesday night, a laptop, and the decision to act because it was right.